The territory line was a scar of rust-colored dust that stretched from one jagged horizon to the other. Elias Thorne followed it, his horse moving with the slow, rhythmic plod of an animal that knew its rider's heart was in no hurry. He had bought the land and the cabin that squatted upon it for $50, a sum that was both an insult and a salvation. An insult to the man who had lost it, a salvation for the man who now claimed it. Elias had paid the clerk in town with crumpled bills that smelled of long-dead campfires and solitude. The clerk hadn't looked him in the eye, simply stamped the deed and slid it across the counter. The cabin was listed as abandoned, derelict, a splinter in the thumb of the county. That suited Elias. He was a man made of derelict parts himself. The structure came into view, a dark tooth against the pale gums of the prairie. It sagged, its spine broken, its windows like vacant eyes. Weeds clawed at its foundation, yet it was his, a place to stop moving, a place where the ghosts of his past might finally grow tired of the chase. He dismounted, the leather of his saddle groaning like a tired man. The air was still, heavy with the weight of emptiness. He walked the perimeter. A porch step had rotted through. The door hung on a single groaning hinge. Inside, the gloom was thick with the smell of decay and mouse leavings. A broken chair lay on its side. A single table stood coated in a film of dust. Sunlight pierced through holes in the roof, spearing the floorboards in pale, shifting columns. He didn't see ruin, he saw work. Work was a balm. It was a language he understood. He set his bedroll in a corner, dropped his saddlebags beside it. He spent the rest of the day clearing the worst of the debris, his movements economical and silent. He patched the largest hole in the roof with a piece of tin he found behind the structure. He swept the floor with a bundle of stiff weeds, raising a choking cloud of forgotten years. As dusk began to bleed across the sky, painting the plains in shades of bruised purple and soft orange, he built a fire in the stone hearth. The flames were a small, defiant life in the cavern of shadows. He sat before it, eating a strip of dried meat, the silence a familiar cloak. But it wasn't silent. Beneath the crackle of the fire, beneath the sigh of the wind through the broken walls, there was another sound, a floorboard, a soft, rhythmic creak. It wasn't the house settling. It was measured, human. Elias stilled, his hand resting on the hilt of the knife at his belt. His eyes scanned the darkened corners of the room. The sound was coming from below. He rose, his boots making no sound on the dusty floor. He moved toward the center of the room, to a large crewed rug woven from rags. He nudged it aside with his foot. There, flush with the floor, was the iron ring of a cellar door. It hadn't been on the county surveyor's notes. The sound came again, clearer this time. A soft shushing, the sound one makes to soothe a restless infant. Elias crouched. His fingers closed around the cold iron ring. He pulled. The door resisted, and lifted with a groan of dry rotted wood, releasing a gust of cool, damp air that smelled of earth and fear. And there, in the sliver of firelight that fell into the dark pit below, two eyes stared back at him, wide, terrified, but unbroken. The eyes belonged to a woman. She was pressed into the far corner of the cramped, earthen cellar, a small, blanket-wrapped bundle held tight against her chest. Her face was smudged with dirt, her hair a tangled mat, but her gaze was a physical force. It was not the pleading look of a beggar, but the cornered glare of a she-wolf. In the flickering firelight, he could see the sharp line of her jaw, the grin set of her lips. She did not scream. She did not speak. She simply watched him, her knuckles white where she clutched the bundle. The bundle stirred, and a tiny, mewling cry escaped it, quickly muffled against her shoulder. A baby. Elias remained crouched at the edge of the opening, his form a dark silhouette against the fire. He said nothing. Words were clumsy tools, prone to breaking things. Instead, He studied the scene. The small pile of dried crusts in the corner. The empty water jug. The desperation that was a palpable odor in the air, sharper than the damp earth. He saw the faint, purpled bruise that encircled her wrist, disappearing beneath the sleeve of her tattered dress. He saw the fierce, exhaustive love with which she shielded the child. He understood. Not the details, not the names or the reasons, but the shape of it. This was a place of hiding, not of habitation. He slowly, deliberately, unhooked the canteen from his belt. The slosh of the water was loud in the tense quiet. He held it out, his arm extended down into the darkness. It was an offering, a truce. The woman's eyes flickered from his face to the canteen and back again. Trust was a currency she did not possess. He saw the war in her expression, the primal needs of thirst and survival battling the instinct of self-preservation. Her child whimpered again, a dry, fretful sound. That decided it. She shifted, her movements stiff from confinement. She reached out a trembling hand, her fingers brushing his as she took the canteen. She never took her eyes off him. She drank, then carefully poured a few drops onto her finger and moistened the baby's lips. She held the canteen for a moment longer, as if weighing its heft, before extending it back up to him. He took it, hooked it back onto his belt. He did not move to close the cellar door. That was another offering, one of freedom, or at least the illusion of it. He rose, his joints popping softly, and walked back to the fire. From his saddlebags, he pulled a small loaf of hard bread and a piece of salted jerky. He walked back to the opening and placed them on the floor, just at the edge of the lamplit darkness. He then took the lantern from the mantelpiece, its wick turned low, and set it beside the food. It cast a gentle, steady glow into the cellar, chasing away the deepest of the shadows, revealing not a monster, but a man who had chosen to give light instead of extinguishing it. He returned to his bedroll, sat with his back against the wall, and took out his knife. He picked up a piece of kindling and began to carve, the blade moving with a slow, hypnotic rhythm. He was not waiting for her. He was simply existing in this new, altered space, letting the silence and the fire and the slow passage of time do the talking for him. He was a patient man. He had learned patience in the crucible of loss. He knew that some things like trust could not be forced. They had to be coaxed out of the dark, into the light on their own terms. The sun was high and sharp when she finally emerged. Elias was outside, resetting a loose stone in the hearth's chimney, his back to the cabin door. He heard the creak of the floorboards, the soft shuffle of hesitant feet on the porch, but he didn't turn. He continued his work, fitting the stone, testing its stability with the flat of his hand. He gave her the dignity of not being watched. When he finally straightened and turned, she was standing near the water pump, the baby a quiet bundle in her arms. The morning light was merciless, showing the exhaustion etched around her eyes, the hollows in her cheeks. Yet she stood tall, her chin lifted. She had washed her face, and her dark hair was combed back with her fingers. It was an act of pride, a small reclamation of self. She looked at him, her gaze direct, and spoke for the first time. Her voice was rough from disuse, but clear. "My name is Elara." He simply nodded. "Elias?" "And this," she said, her voice softening as she looked down at the child, "is Leo." He gave another slight nod, his eyes flickering to the baby for only a second. He did not want to seem like a man who coveted things. He picked up his tools and moved to the broken porch step. He worked with a quiet focus, measuring, sawing a new plank from a piece of weathered lumber he'd salvaged. Elara watched him, her initial fear slowly being replaced by a cautious curiosity. This man was not what she had expected. He did not question her, did not pry. He did not look at her with the possessive hunger she had come to expect from men. His silence was not empty. It felt solid, like a wall she could put her back against. She went back inside the cabin. When Elias came in for water an hour later, he saw she had made a change. A corner of the room had been swept clean, meticulously so. His bedroll had been straightened, the blanket folded. A few wildflowers, plucked from the tenacious clumps growing by the door, sat in a tin cup on the table. They were small gestures, but they spoke volumes. She was not a guest. She was not a prisoner. She was making a home, staking a claim on this space with acts of care. The silence between them began to change. It was no longer the brittle silence of fear and uncertainty, but something softer, a shared quiet that was beginning to feel comfortable. He ate his midday meal on the porch. A few minutes later, she came out and sat on the far end, nursing Leo. They ate without speaking, but the space between them felt charged with unspoken communication. The sun warmed the wood beneath them. A hawk circled in the vast blue overhead. It was peaceful, a stolen moment of normalcy that felt both fragile and profound. That evening, as he mended a strap on his saddlebags, she spoke again. The water in the cellar was almost gone. He didn't look up from his work. "I know. Thank you," she said. The words were small, but they carried immense weight. He paused his work, looked at her directly for the first time since she'd told him her name. Her eyes were clear, steady. He saw not a victim, but a survivor. "You're welcome," he said, and the two words felt like a pact, a promise he hadn't realized he was making. He had bought a cabin to be alone, but solitude had been evicted. In its place was something new, something complicated, something that had a name and a future he was now inextricably tangled in. Days bled into a week. A routine, fragile as a spider's web, began to form. Elias would rise before the sun, his movements quiet so as not to wake them. He worked on the cabin and the land, his hands always busy, mending the roof, clearing the overgrown path to the well, reinforcing the door. Elara would tend to Leo. Her world shrunk to the rhythms of the child's needs. But in the quiet moments between, she expanded her territory. She scrubbed the floors until the wood shone. She patched the threadbare curtains with scraps of her own petticoat. She found a small, untended patch of earth behind the cabin, where the soil was dark and rich, and began turning it over with a broken spade, preparing it for seeds she did not have. They spoke little, but they watched each other constantly. She watched his hands, how they could be both strong enough to heft a log and gentle enough to coax a splinter from his palm. He watched her face when she hummed to the baby, a soft, sad tune that seemed to hold all her history within it. One afternoon, Elias was on the small rise overlooking the track that served as a road, scanning the horizon out of a habit he couldn't shake. His eyes, accustomed to the vast emptiness, caught movement, a dust cloud, small at first, but growing. 3 riders, moving at a steady clip. They were still miles away, but they were headed in this general direction. He felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. He didn't run back to the cabin. He walked, his pace measured, deliberate. He found Elara by her patch of tilled earth, her hands buried in the soil. She looked up as he approached, and she saw the change in him immediately. His stillness was different now. It was not calm, it was coiled. "Riders," he said, just the one word. She straightened up, wiping her hands on her apron. The color drained from her face, but her eyes held no panic, only a grim, resigned knowledge. "How many?" "3," she nodded, her jaw tight. She picked up Leo's basket from the shade and walked swiftly toward the cabin. Elias followed. Inside, he went to his saddlebags and pulled out the rifle. It was old, but well cared for. He checked the action, then held it out to her. "But first, do you know how to use this?" Her gaze was unflinching. "My father taught me." She took the heavy weapon, her hands surprisingly steady. The rifle did not look out of place in her arms. It looked like an extension of the fierce will that had kept her alive in a dark cellar. "Stay inside," he said. "Keep away from the windows." He didn't wait for a reply. He went outside and with unhurried strength dragged the old broken wagon from the side of the yard and positioned it to partially obscure the front door and window. It was a meager shield, but it was something. He took up a position at the corner of the cabin, concealed in the shadow of the chimney, his own pistol in his hand. He watched the riders draw closer. They were rough men, their faces hard, their movements predatory. They slowed as they neared the turnoff to the cabin, their leader pointing. But they didn't turn. They conferred for a moment, then spurred their horses on, continuing down the main track. Elias stayed motionless until their dust cloud was a faint smudge on the horizon again. The immediate danger had passed. But it was a rehearsal, a warning shot. He walked back into the cabin. Elara stood exactly where he had left her, rifle held at a low ready. The silence was thick with the adrenaline of their shared fear. She held the rifle out to him. As he took it, his fingers brushed against her wrist, the one that had been bruised. The mark had faded to a sickly yellow, but it was still there. A testament, a question he had not asked. He looked from the fading bruise to her eyes. "Who are they?" he asked, his voice low. "My husband's brothers," she said, and the words were like stones dropped into a deep well. "They think I belong to them now. Me and my son." The riders were gone, but their presence lingered, a foul taste in the air. The fragile peace of the last week had been shattered, replaced by a tense, vigilant quiet. That night, the sky broke open. A storm, which had been threatening on the horizon for days, rolled in with a theatrical fury. Wind howled around the corners of the mended cabin, shrieking through the unseen cracks. Rain lashed against the windows in horizontal sheets, and thunder cracked like the sky itself was splitting apart. Inside, the fire in the hearth spat and hissed, its light a frail bastion against the roaring dark. Leo, startled by the noise, began to cry. Not his usual fretful whimper, but a full-throated, terrified wail. Elara held him, rocked him, hummed her sad lullaby, but nothing could soothe him. The storm was too loud, the fear in the small room too thick. Elias sat across from them, watching. He saw the tremor in Elara's hands, the exhaustion that was pulling her under. The storm outside was a mirror of the one she had been weathering alone for weeks, for months. He got up and put another log on the fire, the largest one he had. It caught, and the flames roared to life, pushing back the shadows, filling the room with a steady, defiant warmth. He sat back down, closer this time. He didn't speak. He just shared the space, his solid presence a counterweight to the chaos. Finally, in a moment of quiet between claps of thunder, she spoke. Her voice was barely a whisper, almost lost in the wind. His name was Thomas. Elias said nothing, just listened. That was what she needed. Not advice, not pity, just a witness. He was a good man, she continued, her eyes focused on a point somewhere in the fire. Not strong, but kind. He bought a small parcel of land, our land. He wanted to build a life away from them. She swallowed hard. His brothers ... Silas, Jonah, and Caleb Hackett. They are not good men. They are poison. They laughed at him, called him soft. When our father-in-law died, he left everything to Thomas, the eldest. The Hacketts believe the old way, that everything the land, the wife, the child, passes to the next brother, like chattel, like livestock. Another crash of thunder, closer this time, rattled the very bones of the cabin. Leo screamed. Thomas stood up to them. Elara's voice was strained, tight with memory. For the first time in his life, he told them the land was his, that I was his wife, not their property. A week later, he was dead. A hunting accident, they called it. A stray shot. She looked at Elias then, and her eyes were filled with a grief so raw it was painful to see. They came to the house the day after the funeral. "Silas, he's the eldest now. He told me I would be his. He put his hands on me." She unconsciously rubbed the wrist that had been bruised. "I fought him. I took Leo and I ran. I've been running ever since. I ended up here. I thought no one would ever look for a person in a place so broken." The story hung in the air between them, heavy and sharp. It explained everything: the fear, the flight, the cellar, the fierce, protective love for her son, the last piece of a good man in a world of poison. Elias looked at the fire, at the sturdy log he had placed there. It would burn all night. He would make sure of it. He had wanted a place of solitude, a place to forget his own ghosts. But her ghosts had found him, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he would not let them have her. He was no longer just mending a cabin. He was guarding a flame. The storm passed, leaving the world washed clean and glistening. A fragile calm settled over the cabin, but the knowledge of the Hackett brothers was a permanent shadow. The next day, Elias sat on the porch, the afternoon sun warm on his back. He took a small block of pine from his pocket and began to carve. It was a habit from another life, something his hands remembered when his mind wanted to forget. He worked slowly, the knife peeling away thin curls of wood, revealing a shape held within. Elara came to the doorway, Leo asleep in a sling against her chest. She watched his hands, the focused, unhurried movements. The wood was soft, the knife sharp. In less than an hour, a rough shape had emerged. It was a bird, its head cocked, its wings half spread as if about to take flight. He spent another hour on the details, smoothing the edges, carving tiny feathers into the wings, giving it small, dark eyes with the tip of his blade. He worked in total silence, lost in the task. It was a meditation, a prayer made of wood. When he was finished, he held it up. The little bird seemed impossibly alive in his calloused palm. He sanded it smooth with a piece of rough leather until it shone with a soft, buttery light. He held it out to her. Not to her, but to the sleeping child. Elara hesitated for a moment, then reached out and took it. The wood was still warm from his hands. It was a simple thing, a child's toy, but it felt like so much more. It was the first gift her son had ever received. It was a piece of kindness in a world that had shown them none. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice soft. "Where did you learn to do that?" Elias looked out at the horizon, his gaze distant. The question had pricked something deep inside him, a place he kept locked and barred. "A time before," he said, his voice flat. He looked down at his own hands, as if seeing them for the first time. They were hands that had held tools, reins, a gun. They had also held a much smaller hand. He looked back at her, his eyes holding a profound and ancient sadness. "I had a family once," he said. The 4 words were a confession, an entire history of loss laid bare. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Elara understood. She saw it all in the stark grief that flashed in his eyes before he shuddered it away again. His silence wasn't emptiness. It was a memorial. His solitude wasn't a preference. It was a penance. He was a man hollowed out by grief, and he had stumbled upon a woman and child hollowed out by fear. In that moment, something shifted between them. The space was no longer defined by his protection and her vulnerability. It was a shared space of survivors, of 2 broken souls recognizing the jagged edges of the other. She looked at the wooden bird in her hand, then at the sleeping face of her son. Then she looked at the stoic, silent man who carried a world of pain behind his quiet eyes. He had given her son a bird, a symbol of flight, of freedom. And in doing so, he had tethered himself to them, weaving a new thread into the tapestry of his own unraveled life. He was not just a protector. He was becoming something more, something that looked, to her weary heart, remarkably like hope. A week later, Leo fell ill. It started with a fretful night, his skin hot to the touch, his cries weak and breathless. By morning, a fever had taken hold, leaving him listless and flushed. Elara was frantic. She sponged him with cool water from the well, tried to coax a few drops of milk between his pale lips, but the fever only climbed. She was a prisoner of her own fear, watching the life in her child flicker like a weak candle flame. All her resilience, all her strength, felt useless against this invisible enemy. Elias watched her, his face a grim mask. He saw the terror in her eyes, the same terror he had seen once before in the eyes of another woman, long ago. He touched Leo's forehead with the back of his hand. The heat was alarming. He looked at Elara, her face a portrait of despair. "I need to ride out," he said. His voice was calm, but firm. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with a new kind of fear. "No," she whispered. "You can't. They'll see you." He knew she wasn't just afraid of the Hacketts. She was afraid he would not come back, that he would take his horse and his rifle and his ghosts and simply disappear into the horizon, leaving her to face this new horror alone. It was the ultimate test. "I'll be careful," he said. "He needs medicine, the kind you can't find in a field." He didn't wait for her permission. He saddled his horse, tied a small bundle to the back, and mounted. He looked down at her one last time as she stood in the doorway, clutching her sick child, her face a mask of anguish and betrayal. He gave a short, sharp nod and spurred the horse into a gallop, not looking back. The hours crawled by. Elara sat with Leo, the silence of the cabin a crushing weight. Every gust of wind sounded like hoofbeats. Every shadow seemed to take the shape of a man. The hope she had allowed to kindle in her heart turned to ash. He was gone. He had seen the burden they were, the danger they brought, and he had left. It was what everyone else had done. The sun sank below the horizon, and a chilling despair, colder than any cellar, settled over her. Leo's breathing was shallow, his small body frighteningly still. She was alone, just as she always had been. Then she heard it, the sound she had been dreading and praying for, the steady, tired plod of a horse. She ran to the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. In the deep blue of the twilight, a figure emerged. It was Elias. He was soaked through, his horse lathered and spent. He slid from the saddle, stumbling with exhaustion, and untied the bundle. He walked past her into the cabin without a word, his face etched with fatigue, but also with a fierce determination. He opened the bundle on the table. Inside were small glass vials, bundles of dried herbs, and a pouch of bitter-smelling powder. "A Navajo man I know," he said, by way of explanation. "He lives 2 days' ride south. I made it in one." For the rest of the night, they worked together. He showed her how to brew a tea from the herbs, how to mix the powder into a paste to cool the boy's skin. He was no doctor, but he was a man who knew the old ways, the remedies of the earth. He held the lantern while she dribbled the tea into Leo's mouth. He took the child from her when her arms trembled with exhaustion, holding him with a surprising gentleness. They were a team, united against the darkness. As the first pale light of dawn crept into the cabin, Leo stirred. His eyes fluttered open. The fever had broken. The flush was gone from his cheeks, replaced by a healthy, if pale, color. He let out a small, hungry cry. Elara wept, silent tears of relief and gratitude streaming down her face. Elias stood by the window, watching the sunrise. He had not abandoned them. He had ridden into the dark, faced his own ghosts, and brought back a cure. He had proven his loyalty, not with a promise, but with an action. He had shown her that she was no longer alone. And as the sun rose, it felt like the first day of a new season. The breaking of the fever marked a turning point. The unspoken agreement between them solidified into a partnership, forged in shared crisis and quiet gratitude. Life fell into a new rhythm, one defined not by survival, but by building. Elias began to work on the fences. The old ones were rotted, sagging skeletons of wire and wood. He spent his days digging new post holes, his movements strong and sure. The steady thud of his mallet was a constant, reassuring heartbeat on the land. It was the sound of a man putting down roots. Elara, with Leo now healthy and gurgling in a basket in the shade, turned her full attention to the garden. Elias had found a few packets of seeds in the town he'd ridden to corn, beans, squash. She planted them with a reverence usually reserved for prayer. She was not just planting food. She was planting a future. She was turning this forgotten patch of dirt into a place of sustenance and life. Their tasks became a silent conversation. He would leave a neat pile of firewood by the door each evening. She would leave a hot plate of food on the table. She found a rip in his only good shirt and mended it, her stitches small and even. He noticed the handle on her water bucket was splintered and carved a new one, smooth and perfect to the grip. One afternoon, he took her out to the edge of the property, the rifle in his hand. "The Hacketts won't stay away forever," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. "You need to be sure." He set up tin cans on a fence post and had her practice. Her first few shots were wide. "Don't fight it," he said, his voice low as he stood behind her. He didn't touch her, but she could feel his presence, solid and calm. "Breathe out. Squeeze, don't pull." She followed his instruction. She breathed. She squeezed. The can flew off the post. A small, fierce smile touched her lips. She was no longer just a woman who could shoot. She was a woman who could defend her home. Their home, the word echoed in her mind. It was still a broken-down cabin on a piece of forgotten land, but it was becoming theirs. The lines of his and hers were blurring. It was their fire, their garden, their fence. The silence between them was now rich with meaning. A shared glance across the dinner table held an entire conversation. A nod of his head as he inspected her growing corn was a chorus of approval. A small smile from her as he played with Leo, letting the boy clutch his calloused finger, was a declaration of trust. They were two solitary people learning the language of we. The cabin, once a symbol of his solitude and her desperation, was transforming. Under their hands, it was becoming a stronghold, a sanctuary. The wood he carved was no longer just a way to pass the time. It was a way to build a life. The food she grew was not just for survival. It was for nourishment of body and soul. They were not just waiting for the next threat. They were living defiantly and quietly in the calm before the inevitable storm. And in doing so, they were becoming a family, bound not by blood, but by the shared work of their hands and the silent promise in their hearts. The storm arrived on a hot, still Tuesday. The air was heavy, breathless, the kind of quiet that precedes violence. Elias was splitting logs, the axe falling with a clean, rhythmic crack when he saw the dust cloud on the horizon. It was bigger this time. Not 3 riders. 5. He didn't stop his work. He finished splitting the log, stacked the pieces neatly, and wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his arm. Then he picked up the axe and walked toward the cabin. Elara was on the porch, shelling beans into a large wooden bowl. She had seen the dust cloud, too. She didn't look at him, but her hands had stilled. "Go inside," he said, his voice low and even. "Take Leo. Bar the door." She scraped the beans back into the sack and stood, her movements deliberate. "I'll get the rifle." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. She was a part of this defense. He nodded once, a flicker of pride in his eyes. He watched her disappear into the cabin, then turned to face the approaching riders. They rode into the yard and fanned out, a loose semicircle of menace. The man in the center was bigger than the others, with a thick neck and a cruel, self-satisfied smirk. He had a brutish confidence that came from a life of taking what he wanted. This was Silas Hackett. He dismounted, his spurs jingling, and swaggered toward the porch. The other 4 men stayed on their horses, their hands resting near their guns. "This your land, stranger?" Silas asked, his eyes roaming over the cabin, noting the repairs, the smoke curling from the chimney, the signs of life. "It is," Elias said. He stood at the bottom of the porch steps, the axe held loosely in one hand. He was not blocking the way, but his presence was a clear and solid barrier. Silas chuckled, a humorless sound. "Funny, my brother's widow seems to think she has a claim on it. Or at least, what's in it? We've tracked her here." He spat a brown stream of tobacco juice near Elias's boot. "We've come for our property. The woman and the boy. You can hand them over, and we'll be on our way. No need for you to get involved in family business." Elias's expression did not change. His gaze was flat, his body relaxed but ready. He looked at Silas, then let his eyes drift over the other 4 men, assessing them, memorizing them. "She's not a thing to claim," he said. The words were quiet, but they landed with the force of a hammer blow. Silas's smirk faltered. He took a step closer, trying to use his size to intimidate. "I don't think you heard me. That woman is a Hackett now. That makes her mine. The boy, too. He's my blood. We have a right." "You have no rights here," Elias replied, his voice still level. He was not angry. He was something far more dangerous. Certain. The tension in the yard stretched thin, ready to snap. The other riders shifted on their horses, their casual posture tightening. Silas's face darkened with rage. He was not used to being denied. He was a bully, and his power relied on the fear of others. This quiet, unmovable man before him showed no fear at all. "This is your last chance," Silas snarled, his hand dropping to the butt of his pistol. "Give them to me." "No," Elias said. The single word was a declaration of war. It was a line drawn in the dust of the yard, a promise he intended to keep with his life. The yard was silent for a beat, the world holding its breath. Then Silas's lips curled into a sneer. "Have it your way, then. But you'll learn. Everything on this land belongs to a Hackett." He turned, swung himself back onto his horse. "We'll be back," he promised. "And when we come, we're taking it all." They wheeled their horses around and rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and threats hanging in the hot, still air. The Hacketts did not go far. They made a rough camp on a low ridge a half-mile away, their campfire a malevolent red eye in the gathering dusk. They were settling in for a siege. They thought time was on their side. They believed they could break the will of the 2 people in the small, isolated cabin. They were wrong. They had mistaken quiet for weakness and solitude for vulnerability. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with a tense, focused calm. Elias and Elara moved with a shared purpose, their actions a seamless, unspoken dialogue. He barred the door with a heavy plank of wood he had saved for this very purpose. She wedged shutters, which he had built weeks ago, into the window frames, plunging the room into a dim, protected twilight. The only light came from the fire and a single, low-burning lantern. She moved the cradle with the sleeping Leo into the safest corner of the room, behind the solid stone mass of the hearth. Elias checked his pistol, cleaning the barrel, loading each chamber with a slow, deliberate precision. Elara took the rifle, her movements just as sure. She laid out the extra cartridges on the table, a neat, deadly row. There was no panic, no frantic rush. There was only a grim, methodical preparation for the violence they knew was coming. They sat at the table, the weapons between them, and ate a cold meal of bread and jerky. The food was tasteless, but they ate because they needed the strength. The silence in the room was absolute, a stark contrast to the storm that was brewing outside. Finally, Elara broke it, her voice a low murmur. "Are you scared?" Elias looked at the rifle resting near her hand, at the determined set of her jaw. He saw the fear in her eyes, but it was overshadowed by something else. A fierce, unyielding resolve. She was no longer the terrified woman from the cellar. She was a warrior defending her child, her home. He thought of his own past, of the family he had failed to protect. The fear was there, a cold, familiar stone in his gut, but this time was different. This time he was not alone. This time he was fighting for a future, not just mourning a past. "No," he said. It was a lie, but it was a necessary one. It was a gift to her, a shield for her to hold on to. She gave him a small, grateful nod. She knew it was a lie, but she accepted the gift. They sat in silence for another hour as the darkness outside became complete. The Hacketts' fire glowed on the ridge. They were waiting for the deepest part of the night, for the moon to set. Elias rose and went to the small crack in one of the window shutters. He peered out, his eyes adjusted to the dark. "They're moving," he said. Elara stood, picking up the rifle. She moved to the shuttered window on the other side of the cabin, finding a similar crack to watch through. They were two wolves in their den, back to back, ready for the pack. The time for mending and building was over. The time for talk was done. The quiet man and the resilient woman stood their ground, their small repaired cabin transformed into a fortress. It wasn't just wood and stone anymore. It was a testament to their shared will, and they would defend it to the last. The attack came with the chilling silence of predators. There was no yelling, no wild charge. Just the soft thud of boots on dry earth as the Hacketts fanned out to surround the cabin. The moon had set, leaving the world in an inky blackness, broken only by the cold, distant light of the stars. Inside, Elias and Elara were two statues in the gloom, listening. Elias heard the faint scrape of leather against wood near the front door. He raised his pistol, aiming at the center of the heavy plank he had used as a bar. He waited. A heavy shoulder slammed against the door. The wood groaned but held. Another slam, harder this time. Then a splintering crack. A third slam, and the door burst inward, the bar ripped from its moorings. A dark shape filled the doorway. Elias fired. The roar of the pistol was deafening in the confined space. The shape grunted and fell backward out of sight. At the same moment, a window shutter on the side of the cabin shattered, ripped away from the outside. The muzzle of a rifle poked through the opening. From her position, Elara was ready. She fired her own rifle, the stock pressed tight against her shoulder, just as Elias had taught her. The sound of the shot was followed by a scream of pain and the clatter of a dropped weapon. Two down. Shouts erupted from the darkness outside. The element of surprise was gone, replaced by rage. Gunfire exploded from two different directions, bullets thudding into the thick log walls of the cabin. Splinters flew. Elias and Elara dropped to the floor, crawling to new positions, making themselves moving targets. He moved to the side of the shattered doorway. She took cover behind the overturned table. "Stay low," Elias yelled, his voice cutting through the chaos. A figure darted past the open door, firing wildly into the room. Elias leaned out, fired twice. The man staggered, clutched his chest, and fell. 3 down. The gunfire from outside intensified. They were panicked now, shooting at shadows. Elias knew they had 2 left, Silas and one other. "Where's the other one?" Elara called out, her voice steady despite the ringing in her ears. A floorboard creaked above them. The attic. The 5th man had climbed onto the roof. Elias looked up. He saw the barrel of a shotgun poke through a gap in the ceiling where he had yet to complete a patch. He shoved Elara, hard. "Move," he yelled, just as the shotgun blasted, a deafening roar that filled the room with smoke and the smell of sulfur. The shot tore through the space where she had been a second before, peppering the wall with lead. Elias didn't hesitate. He raised his pistol and fired upward, emptying the last 2 rounds into the ceiling. A heavy thump from above told him the threat was gone. 4. Only Silas remained. Silence fell, thick and heavy. "Silas!" Elias yelled into the night. "It's over. Ride away now." The only answer was a furious roar from the darkness, followed by the thunder of hooves. Silas was making a final desperate charge on horseback, firing his pistol as he came, aiming for the open doorway. Elias saw him coming, a huge raging silhouette against the starlit sky. He dropped his empty pistol and grabbed the axe he had left by the hearth. He met the charge on the porch. The horse reared as Elias swung the axe, not at the man, but at the animal's legs. It was a brutal, terrible act, but it was necessary. The horse screamed and went down in a tangle of limbs. Silas was thrown clear, landing hard in the dust. He came up, gasping for air, his pistol lost in the fall. He saw Elias standing over him, axe in hand, a grim specter in the faint light. Silas scrambled backward, his arrogance gone, replaced by raw, primal fear. He was no longer the bully, the predator. He was just a man, disarmed and terrified. Elias stood there for a long moment, the axe held ready. He could end it. He could deliver the final, brutal justice. But he looked past Silas, at the cabin, where Elara was already lighting a new lantern. He heard the faint, sleepy cry of Leo, safe in his cradle. He lowered the axe. "Get up," he said, his voice ragged. "Get on your horse and ride. And if you ever come back, I will not let you leave." Silas stared, then scrambled to his feet, found his horse's reins, and fled into the night, a broken man. The battle was over. The sun rose on a scene of quiet devastation. The yard was scarred, the cabin door hung in splinters, and the air was still thick with the metallic tang of gunpowder. But the silence was no longer tense. It was the deep, resonant silence of survival. Inside, Elara had lit a fire and was heating water. Leo was awake, babbling softly in his cradle, oblivious to the night of violence that had secured his future. Elias sat at the table, his shirt off, while Elara cleaned a deep gash on his arm where a stray bullet had grazed him. Her touch was gentle, her movements efficient. They didn't speak of the bodies in the yard. They would deal with that later. For now, they tended to the living. When she finished wrapping the wound, he looked at her. He saw a smudge of gunpowder on her cheek and the profound exhaustion in her eyes. But underneath it all, he saw a strength that humbled him. She had not flinched. She had stood her ground. He reached out and with his thumb gently wiped the smudge from her skin. It was the most intimate gesture that had ever passed between them. A current of understanding, of shared history and mutual respect flowed in that simple touch. The healing of the land began alongside their own. Elias buried the Hackett men in a far corner of the property, marking their graves with simple, unnamed stones. It was a somber, necessary task. Then he began to rebuild. He crafted a new door, stronger than the last. He repaired the shattered window, mended the holes in the walls and the roof. Elara cleared the debris from the yard and tended to her garden with a renewed ferocity. The seasons turned. Summer bled into a golden autumn. The corn grew tall, and the squash ripened on the vine. The fence Elias had been building was finally complete, a sturdy, unbroken line encircling their home. The cabin stood whole and strong, a testament to their labor. The $50 ruin was now a sanctuary. One crisp fall afternoon, Elias was on the porch, watching as Leo, now a sturdy toddler, took his first wobbly steps across the yard. The boy stumbled, fell, and looked up at Elias with a comical expression of surprise. Elias felt a smile tug at the corners of his mouth, a real, unforced smile that reached his eyes. Elara came out, and sat on the steps beside him, leaning her head against his shoulder. It felt natural. It felt right. They watched as Leo picked himself up and took another determined step, then another. They had created this. This peace, this safety, this small, perfect moment. The ghosts of his past were still there, but they were quieter now. Their voices were drowned out by the sound of a child's laughter and the steady beat of the heart of the woman beside him. He had come to this place seeking an ending, a quiet place to let his story run out. Instead, he had found a beginning. So here ends the story of a $50 cabin, of a quiet rancher and a hunted widow. Or perhaps it is not an end at all, but simply the closing of one chapter and the turning of a page to the next. The true work was not in mending the fences or rebuilding the walls, but in reconstructing the broken pieces of two lives into a single, stronger whole. They built more than a home. They built a family, founded not on a shared past, but on the promise of a shared future. It is a simple tale, one of many spun on the vast, unforgiving loom of the frontier, a testament to the fact that even in the most desolate of places, hope can take root. Before you go, tell me, what is the true price of a sanctuary? Is it paid in dollars and deeds, or is it earned with courage, with loyalty, and with the quiet daily labor of love?